Hey everyone, I'm Brazen Eagle. So today I'm going to talk about the United States federal budget, the debt, the effects of the debt on us, and potential solutions to get us out of this debt hole. So I'm going to preface this by telling you that we're going to hear a lot of numbers in this video. So by debt, we mean that we as the American people owe other people or organizations money. You will also often hear in the media that we are running a deficit. That means for the current year, the federal government spends more money than it takes in, which leads ultimately to debt. Pretty simple. So for the fiscal year of 2018, the United States government received an estimated $3.34 trillion in revenue. That's a ton of money that the government receives. However, the same fiscal year for expenditures was an estimated $4.173 trillion. That meant for the fiscal year of 2018, we, as American taxpayers and ultimately the government, had a budget deficit of $833 billion. How are we supposed to pay off that much debt from 2018 when we run a deficit almost every single year? So, before I give you more hard numbers, you need to understand that we have two different terms that regulate how the federal government spends money. We have what we call discretionary spending, which is the literal amount of money that Congress must agree upon to spend on for the year. Then we also have non-discretionary spending, also known as mandatory spending. Mandatory spending obviously means that the programs under this term must be paid first, and everything else will have to wait for funding. A key difference, though, is that mandatory spending occurs each year without congressional interference, unless Congress decides to change something. Keep these two in mind as I lay out how the federal government spends money. So, actual spending. On screen, you can see how the federal government spends its money. The largest portion of money that is spent is on healthcare, at 27% of the federal budget. Now, what the image does not show is that the healthcare portion is actually two government programs called Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is a national health insurance program for old people, for the elderly. Medicaid is health insurance for poor people, people who can't afford very much. We spend a combined over $1.1 trillion on Medicare and Medicaid. And all this money spent for this health insurance for the poor and elderly, that's it, they don't cover everyone. Medicare costs more than $500 billion, while Medicaid costs a little less than $500 billion. Trying to pinpoint exactly what numbers each program costs is just a little difficult. The next largest portion is Social Security spending, which is called pensions in this chart, at 25% of the budget. This costs the government, or really the taxpayers, a little over $1 trillion. That's insane. That's absolutely insane. Just Social Security alone costs over $1 trillion. Now, defense takes 22% of the entire federal budget, which is an estimated $892 billion, just a little under $900 billion. This defense portion includes, though, the Department of Veteran Affairs, the Department of Defense, the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and, surprisingly, the Department of Energy. So, we have already discussed how the government spends 74% of its money. The remaining portions of spending is allocated by 8%, or $351.9 billion on welfare, which includes the Food Assistance or Food Stamps program, unemployment compensation, housing assistance, and more. 8%, or $324.7 billion, is spent on the debt interest alone. Education costs $106.8 billion, or 3% of the federal budget. The last 7% of federal spending is spent on protection, such as the police, fire protection services, and prisons, at 1%, or $37.4 billion, on transportation, which is $93.2 billion, or 2% of the federal budget, and on general government and other spending at a combined $151.5 billion, or 4% of the budget. So, with all those hard numbers in store, obviously, Social Security is the largest drain on federal spending, with Medicare and Medicaid combined being the second largest contributor. The defense portion is third, with 22% of the entire federal budget, but includes more than just the military. Social Security is a little more complicated of a program because of the money it has built up since its inception, which I will do a video later on. That being said, Social Security will cost more money to the government every year because there are more people retiring and eligible to receive payments from the government. However, the amount of money needed to pay for Social Security every year does not grow at the same rate as the cost of Social Security. So for the first time in United States history, for the fiscal year of 2018, Social Security has finally started to have more expenditures than revenue. It's literally costing more to run the program than it receives from the taxpayers. Now, I could go into why Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare cost so much, but those videos are for another day. This is talking about the US debt. The main reason why defense costs so much is because of the conflicts we are currently in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, as well as maintenance for soldiers, equipment, and logistics. So, what programs are under the discretionary label, and what programs are under the mandatory spending label? It was difficult trying to find exact information regarding every single department and program, and whether it was considered mandatory or discretionary. But mandatory spending does include Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare benefits such as food handouts, housing assistance, and more. Mandatory spending made up 61.5% of all federal spending, which was over $2.5 trillion out of a budget of $4.1 trillion. Discretionary spending for the fiscal year of 2018 was $1,280 billion, which was 30.9% of the federal budget. This includes money for defense, Homeland Security, Department of Energy, and more, like I said earlier. The 7.6% of the spending went to paying the interest on our current debt, which was $316 billion. So, how can we keep running our government with increasing debt? So, at this point, you need to understand that the United States government has borrowed money to pay for its expenditures from other organizations, countries, or even its own government programs that have a surplus. This is how we can continue to run the government. As we can continue to borrow more money, we will obviously have to pay it back eventually, but creating large deficits every year causes the interest on our debt to keep growing. Eventually, we will have deficits that will exceed $1 trillion a year, and there will eventually come a time when we will either have to raise taxes to pay for the programs or cut spending on them. And when we have a deficit over $1 trillion, that'll happen projected within 2 to 3 years from now. So, what are the effects of a massive national debt? Well, for one, when the federal government borrows money, it creates treasury bonds to sell. This is similar to what I just explained a little earlier. With an increased number of treasury bonds, the cost per bond decreases and ultimately have higher interest rates. And when you have higher interest rates, the cost of borrowing also increases. Ultimately, when the government raises rates on the treasury bonds, it pushes up long-term rates on other items, which include mortgages for housing and student loans. That means less money for people to use to invest in other items. The second effect is heavily related to the first. The less money people have, the less they can spend on businesses. And when businesses lose too much money from consumers not spending money on them, they can go out of business, which leads to further job loss and less taxes for the government. And the third effect is that as the federal debt increases, confidence in the government to be able to pay back its debt becomes lower. Look at the governments of Greece and Italy. a lot of people don't have very much faith in those governments. Because they have borrowed so much money, like I just said, people just don't trust them. And then we make a lot of jokes about Greece not being able to pay back its debt. We, at this point, are not at the point of no return. The United States can get away with more national debt than most countries, but we are not invincible. We are not impervious to economic effects. Eventually, we can lose the dollar as the world's reserve currency if we do not fix our debt. So, solutions. We need a couple solutions here, right? How do we solve this? By law, we must pay for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and general welfare first before anything, which includes the military. That's kind of stupid. That's really, really stupid, actually. These social programs cost more than 50% of the entire federal budget from 2018. Because they are regulated to function on their own, members from Congress have to pass a bill to alter the regulations of who gets benefits from these social welfare programs. If congressmen and women do that, though, the people will vote them out in the next election. It is literally political suicide if congressmen and congresswomen vote to shrink any social welfare program. In 2012, for example, there were an estimated 151 million Americans who received some sort of benefit from one of the federal social programs. And because every non-felon citizen has a right to vote, people will not vote for representatives or senators that will cut off their payments from the government. See the problem? In essence, congressmen and congresswomen refuse to reform social programs that are eating up our current and future money. A potential solution might be to institute term limits so that congressmen and women may be more inclined to reform spending, but honestly really wouldn't help solve the problem. There really is no way to reform this. There really is no way for us to reform this debt until we falter at the last hour. Literally no legal way we can reform this. Like I said, the only realistic solution is for some sort of revolution to occur that forces the federal government to make sure that we pay off most, if not all, of our debt. So, you may ask yourself, so why are people uninterested in this? If this is such a serious problem, why are people uninterested? Well, for starters, people, like I said, people are getting paid by the government to keep the system up. They do not want to lose the money that taxpayers are paying in. People want free stuff without earning it. Another reason is that it really doesn't affect us too much in our daily lives, to be perfectly honest. Yes, higher interest rates hurt us currently, but it's not at a too high of a level yet. It's like the myth of trying to boil a frog. The frog represents us, and the slowly heated water is the debt. At some point, we will hit critical debt levels as we feel the increasing effects, and we need to either lower the temperature or jump out. Lastly, people do not want to hear the truth, that their social programs are bankrupting us as a nation. People would rather hear a good lie than an uncomfortable truth. So, at the end of the day, understand that Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and of course welfare, are all drains on us. Spending money on defense is costly, of course, but it's not the most immediate danger to our financial lives. Even if we got rid of the entire defense portion of spending money, like I showed you in the chart earlier, we would only run a surplus of $9 billion. That's not much. That's almost nothing compared to how much we actually spend. I would love to see us out of foreign wars, but to survive as a nation and a people, we need to eliminate, or at the very least, shrink the size of these programs so that they do not harm our future or the future of future Americans. If you want a program like Social Security that will give you money when you retire, invest when you are young. If you need medical attention, why do other people have to pay it for you? That doesn't provide a benefit for the taxpayer, not the taxpayer's fault that you have a medical issue. Is it considered greedy when someone doesn't want to pay for your needs? Pay for your own services. So, I'm going to leave you with a few words here. The American Republic can only endure until politicians realize that they can bribe the people with their own money. It just takes some time for the system to collapse. With that in mind, thank you very much for watching. I, of course, am Brazen Eagle, and I hope you have a great day.